critical. TO 1999 finds that there's no evidence that the South African boycotts had any effect on profits, and likewise tobacco still earned one of the largest dividends as an industry. And I think I'm really concerned actually that when you look at economists and you look at people in the financial sector and you ask them about divestment, they're really not worried about it. I had what was a really heartbreaking conversation for me with one of the head lobbyists of the British Plastic Federation. So one of these very shady kind of institutions that lobby the government to asking them for more rights. And I asked them, are you worried at all about divestment? And they told me straight up no, they're really not worried about it. What they are worried about is regulation, the active government, the fiduciary principle, and all these things that you've mentioned. But these are all things that fall outside of divestment as a process in and of itself. And I'm a bit worried that when students are putting so much attention to what I see as something that really doesn't have that much support behind it, when instead we could be channeling that to what are much more productive ways, that might be a much better way for us to actually make a change and actually achieve that positive future that you guys have all been talking about.
Okay, thanks. Good questions. I can take a couple more questions and then take some answers from the panel. There was one over there. Yeah.
Yeah, so I had a related, not entirely dissimilar question, which is where one's efforts are best applied. I mean, my comment is that there isn't really such a thing as a free market. Companies and the market operate within a regulatory framework, and the regulatory framework is set by government. The success of the wind and photovoltaics, to some extent, was kick-started by feed-in tariffs, which I think were first thought of in Germany and then adopted by the UK, and that actually created the financial incentives for the free market to invest in photovoltaics and wind energy, and that actually provided the beneficial effect, but that was through actually regulatory pressure rather than pressure on the companies themselves. So I guess my question is, would our efforts be better focused on encouraging politicians to make a better regulatory environment, to encourage the free market to operate in the way in which we want it to, and just accept that companies are always going to be maximising profits within the rules that we set them?
Okay, great. Another good question. I'll take a third question before we show them in the panel. We're going to wait on this one. Okay, go for it.
I was kind of going to touch on that point, and also one of the points you made about oil companies which aren't private but are owned by countries and governments, and that is that in my old job we used to invest in bonds issued by, for example, Saudi Aramco and the largest oil company, Venezuela. And so there are instruments issued by these companies that trade in public markets and that investors can choose to invest in or not invest in. And you have opportunities to engage with those companies through that process. So that is something you can do as an investor. And then with regards to the point that was raised about divestment not having an impact, if you look at capital raising in the oil and gas sector, around 10 to 5% is raised through shares. The rest is through bonds and through bank loans. And as investors, you invest in bonds and you also invest in banks. And so I think you can look at it from a more holistic perspective as well. So it's more of a point than a question.
Great, okay, but that can help people, I think, add a bit more detail to their answers. I'm going to ask Fiona to answer first some of these questions about how divestment works and some of the other considerations that we want to have.
Thank you. And that's a very important point that you've raised there about the different bonds and so on. Because, the companies are less accountable. They might have to go to capital markets to raise money through bonds and so on, and someone's got to buy those bonds in order to get them the money. But that's less accountable than having shareholders where you have an AGM and you can come and you can exert the kind of pressure that the other question was talking about. So yes, there is a way of exerting pressure through the bond markets and so on, but it's far more indirect than through shareholder pressure. I agree. The question about does divestment have an effect? Well, today BP, the new chief executive of BP, Mr. Rowan, has come forward with plans to make BP net zero emissions by mid-century. You can be sceptical about those plans and so on, but there's no way that he would have come forward with those plans had it not been for the concerted public campaigns that we've seen. Divestment's not the only such campaign, but it's part of that. So we've seen the campaigns as well on sponsorship, BP's sponsorship of art galleries and so on, Shell's sponsorship of museums, all of that kind of stuff has come under scrutiny, and they've come under a great deal of public pressure and public shame because of that. And what we have to say is you can't say that you can't draw a direct line between, we have a divestment campaign for the last X years, and hey, BP makes a new commitment to go net zero in 2020. You can't draw a direct line, but you can say that this has had an effect, that had it not been for this pressure that's coming from all directions, from shareholders, from the public, from governments as well, from other businesses as well, that you would not have had that kind of movement. So yeah, I think we can notch developments like that up as a victory to divestment.
I think that's right. It's important to be reminded that divestment is not a magic bullet here, and that I think we'd all agree about. What does it do? It pushes the agenda, I think, as Fiona said. Reputational questions are inevitably brought into the spotlight by public acts of divestment, and companies care about their reputations because they have to attract shareholders. It's not rapid, it's not magic, but I think there is a cumulative effect. And I was thinking not just of BP, but of experience recently in some Christian aid campaigns where we, 2 years ago, were targeting the major high street banks on fossil fuel loans and so forth. And we wrote a fairly strongly worded and substantial document circulated to the main banks. HSBC was the only one that came back to us asking for further conversation. But in that further conversation, a lot of very interesting ground was covered. Not that I'm saying we made a huge difference to HSBC, but what came into focus was some of what they were already doing in response to pressure like ours, which would not otherwise have happened. And we managed to get them to say that they would review certain aspects of their current policy within 5 years in relation to some very specific questions we'd raised about the exemptions that their policy allowed for continuing to invest in certain areas. So that's not directly about disinvestment, it's about the general reputational pressurizing the civil society issue. Banks are an important target for discussion and partnering conversation here, I would say. And my colleagues and I in Christian Aid were a bit more impressed than we expected to be by the candour of the response we had.
So is there anything you want to add to this particular discussion?
Yeah, kind of, because it was quite a big challenge in a way. You were kind of making quite a big challenge, and it's fair enough to make that challenge. I think what you were talking about actually reflects a discussion within the financial sector, particularly amongst ethical investors, sustainable investors, responsible investors, which is a debate about exit versus voice. So if you are invested in a company that is not performing according to the criteria that your clients would like it to perform to, what do you do in those circumstances? And you were suggesting that you may have more influence actually by holding those shares and operating as a shareholder in an annual general meeting in ways which would change the behaviour of that company. And that's the voice side of the argument. It's a very legitimate thing to do for as long as that voice is listened to, is effective within the company, and is changing the behaviour of that company. And actually a lot of the investment managers that for example, that I've worked with and known about and who are now managing those kinds of funds would be absolutely on board with that idea that you don't just dump funds. You do try to work inside the funds in order to change the behaviour of companies. But then there has to come a point, and it is a duty to, as a fund manager, it's a duty to the people who are essentially your clients, where people want to put money. And if those people want to put their money in funds which are ethical and responsible and sustainable, and you're sitting in a company which you know not to be sustainable, actually you have a responsibility to those clients, in fact, to shift those funds. And you're right up to a point to say that you shift them into a market where they might be bought by someone else. But actually, if enough people do that, then the share price does fall. They become less attractive of funds. They become less fundable, even by banks. In fact, you won't fund if the share price is falling in a company very fast. And you are having an impact in the world. Now, we can argue whether that's the primary impact and whether it had whether the boycott had an effect in South Africa. I mean, I remember that campaign, and there were lots of things going on at that point in time. There were people boycotting South African products. There were people on demonstrations outside the South African embassy in London. There was a campaign that at that time Mandela was in prison. One brave man in prison for a very long time actually has an impact on society in ways that are totally unpredictable. And you talk about the tobacco lobby, but actually the situation with tobacco was equally complex, but it arose, and the shift that we have seen actually in the performance of tobacco companies and their ability to take over the health lives of young people has changed radically in the space of years because of lots of different kinds of behaviour. Divest is not enough on its own. I think that's a really strong point. Invest is absolutely critical alongside divest, and campaigning for the conditions under which the investments that are in the right things are the ones that are profitable in the market and succeed. Campaigning to government, campaigning for legislation, campaigning to the college, campaigning to, and thinking about your own personal responsibility in that, it seems to be is really, really important. I mean, actually, to me, my instinctive reaction to what you were saying came back to exactly to what Rowan was saying. How do we want to live in the world in which we are? Do we want our money to be used in a responsible way, or do we not? And ultimately, I think that's the responsibility of us as individuals. It's the responsibility of funds who are producing ethical and sustainable funds for our savings to get right. And sometimes that must mean exit, because actually the change isn't happening any other way.
Okay, good. And then to take on that's really, really interesting and excellent answers. Just to take on the second framing of the question, which is, where are our efforts best applied? And I think that was asked really generally because there are lots of different people who are making efforts towards the sort of the overall climate change goals that we were talking about. But how might you answer that question? Where can different people in the room apply their efforts best?
As I mentioned earlier, the fact that we have a major UN conference this year in this country, I think gives us an opportunity and gives us a kind of amplifies our voices. Just the fact of having it and having it here. So I think we should all be thinking of how we can take advantage of that. And if you want, as we've just heard, it's very important not to see divestment as the only thing that you do, or to see it in isolation. It's got to be part of a kind of broader effort and broader movement. And I think that whatever you can do to kind of to use this opportunity of COP26, which will be one of the final opportunities that we have as a world to get back on track, to meet the goals that were set out in Paris, to stay within the warnings set out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is one of the last opportunities. We should all be thinking what we can do this year.
Quite a lot is about keeping this in the forefront of public attention, I think, which is why the apparently symbolic gesture, which doesn't have a great deal of measurable practical impact immediately, is still significant. So somebody deciding, myself, yourselves, ourselves, deciding not to fly for a period, okay, it doesn't change everything overnight, but it keeps things in perspective. I think one of the questions to ask for any activist is, well, what can I actually do that will simply give some extra visibility to this question? Then, yes, as we've been reminded, there are lots of tactics to follow, lots of routes, which may be active lobbying of government above all, which may be pressure for disinvestment, which may be campaigns for lifestyle change. They all matter, they're all essential to this.
Yeah, I mean, I always think that question of what would be best to do, what should each individual do, actually is a very individual choice. I mean, it's somewhere between what the world needs, what you have as skills, and what opportunities you have to make those changes, I would absolutely reinforce the fact that in order for investment decisions to be going in the right direction and investment funds to be going in the right direction, the conditions for that have to be right. So campaigning for policy changes, working inside government with sympathetic members of parliament towards devising early day motions which will bring these things to the attention of government, or organising a campaign within your college to change the way that investment is made within the college. I mean, to me, where your opportunities are and where your passion is, that's where your choice is as an individual to operate in what is, you know, a huge challenge, but actually one in which there are many, many points of intervention.
Okay, great. I just make a little comment. My views, my position as chair. I think those questions also illustrate you're asking these questions in good faith. You want to help make this change, and you're thinking, how can I do it best? Or you're thinking, should we divest or engage? I think you should be awake to the fact that a lot of people ask those same questions in bad faith. So they ask, should we divest or engage? And they say, well, we should just engage. But are they engaging as shareholders? And the same goes for, they'll say, where shall I put my best effort in? So that this time they don't make an effort, but next time they also don't make an effort. So I think be conscious that these are really valid and difficult questions. There's lots we need to do, but don't allow yourself to be distracted from people who ask those questions in bad faith.
It's really interesting, actually, that also to think about how you know, even in good faith, what your opportunities are to engage. We know from our experience in working in sustainable investment that actually the best way to engage, if you're engaging as an investor, is to turn up at the annual general meeting and vote against the remuneration package for the executives. But that is about it. That's about all you can do, and you have to muster enough behind you, enough momentum behind you. But of course it does really affect the decisions if you do vote down the remuneration package, because then the executives will kind of get the message. So it's there's a limited amount of that shareholder action in the context of many of these companies can actually achieve. But it is something worth doing. Some of the biggest wins actually in those conversations come from, not from that voting down shareholder remuneration packages, but actually from engaging with the people who are running sustainability in those companies and who can see the writing on the wall. They can see the kids who no longer want to come and work for the company because it's not a very nice place to be. They can see the changes in the stock market. They can see the opportunities that exist in funds that outperform the ones that they're expecting to perform best because they're in these extractive industries. So there's many opportunities, but that question of exit versus voice is one that comes up again and again in the decision-making processes of financial institutions.
Can I just add actually as well that when you're choosing where to put your investments, you've got to bear in mind also that not all green funds are the same, because there's an awful lot of funds that label themselves as green, which are nothing of the kind. And you can have, it's quite legal for you to market a fund for people to invest in, calling it the greenest, most sustainable fund ever. And yet you look into that fund and it's invested all over the place in fossil fuels. And it's perfectly legal for companies to do that, and they do it all the time. So whenever you are looking at alternative investments, you've got to be really, really careful, because it doesn't always do what it says on the tin.
Okay, good. So I'm going to take another round of questions. Since Tim has fought so valiantly for women to be at college, I would like to start with the.
So this isn't a question, it's just a request. If anyone would like to feed into the university's report on divestment with comments that can be anonymized or on the record, please let me know. I'd really appreciate your thoughts. This has been a really helpful discussion.
I'm going to just wait a moment till I see more women put up their hands. Okay, thank you. I see one there, yeah.
Yeah, hopefully this will be quite a quick one in relation to what was just discussed. For those of us who are not as economically literate as some of our distinguished audience members and panelists, I suppose one of the questions raised for me about this, this idea of shareholder influence from within is in the situation of the college, in which I think I'm correct in saying a majority of the investments are indirect. Is that as strong of an argument in terms of influencing conversations from within fossil fuel companies if you don't have that same kind of access? I mean, perhaps I'm wrong in suggesting that, but I think it's important to remember that we are talking about a college context here of divestment, and so surely that argument doesn't quite hold up as well.
Okay, good. So question there about indirect investment. Any others? I'm just going to wait. Sorry, I just want to encourage women's voice in the room. We have equal panels. We should have equal number of questions. I'm sure you have some. Okay, well, while you're thinking, someone front.
This is less of a question and more a point on the whole kind of notion of shareholder engagement. And what's the source to it now? Share Action has a proposal tracker from different shareholders towards companies' boards, and it tracks proposals to fossil fuel companies around the idea of the notion of like setting targets for low carbon targets, that kind of thing. And if you scroll through it, historically, these kind of propositions are historically incredibly unsuccessful. Like the majority of propositions will have less than 10% of shareholder support. One notable exception is last year when BP got a 99.75% positive vote on a resolution, but that was only because the board themselves told all their shareholders to vote for it. The rest of them are wildly unsuccessful usually.
Okay, good. Any further questions for the panel? Sorry, one minute.
Yes, so as someone that's been arguing for thoroughgoing and meaningful realignment of our investment strategy, both here on the College Council and also in the University Council, the blocks of concrete that are always thrown out to sort of derail the proposition is firstly the responsibility of fiduciaries, as we've already heard, and of course Rowan will understand the irony of the fact that the legal obligations of fiduciaries are defined by a case law which is the Bishop of Oxford versus the Church Commissioners from way back in time. And so my question is, are we really obliged to obey these sorts of legal precedents when we're facing such a critical issue for the whole future of humanity? And the second thing that is always put forward in these discussions about divestment in the College and University Council is really a council of despair and powerlessness. That if we do this, it's not going to have any impact, and it's just virtue signalling. What do you think about that argument, and how should it be responded to?
Okay, great, thanks. Any other questions at the moment? Well, you can come back and continue discussion in the break, well, when we're having drinks. Okay, so if we can just, the first question was asking just a little bit more detail from someone here about how it might work if we're invested indirectly. To what extent can you actually have control as a shareholder in that way?
Yeah, you don't. I mean, you're absolutely right that as an indirect investor, even as a direct investor, you have limited ability as an individual shareholder to change the direction of the company. As an indirect investor, you have virtually none. So if you're asking, should I not take my pension, put it in the equities, rather I should keep it in the brown funds and go and talk to or write to the people who ultimately own my pension, it's a no-brainer. You move your funds. You do the only thing that you can do in those circumstances, and that's interestingly even true of mixed fund managers. So where you have a kind of portfolio of investments, or whether you have indirect investments as a fund in other funds, you're again in the same position. The distance between the shareholder, whoever they are, which is ordinary people basically with pensions and savings somewhere, and the decisions made by the company is enormous. So I think I'm not dismissing the idea of voice. I think it is important, but I do think that there's a long way between the shareholder and those actions. That's a very good point. Are we obliged to obey legal precedents? I mean, I assume that's a more or less rhetorical question, which I would answer with a kind of a no, because the circumstances are so extreme that we're facing, because the decisions of 100 or even 10 years ago are no longer relevant as legal decisions to the circumstances in which we find ourselves, and because actually, even legal philosophers would argue that the point at which the government no longer has legitimacy is the point at which it's no longer protecting the interests of its citizens, and that's a very long-standing kind of philosophical argument, and we definitely find ourselves in that situation now.
I'm just going to allow a little intervention question. I think you want to know
and
more
it's
about
not even a question again, but actually I just want to say the legal framework on this has been quite settled. It is not a risk for trustees legally to go for divestment. It's a two-part test. We have sufficient consensus at the university around the issue of climate change, and there isn't enough evidence of severe harm to potential harm to the portfolio to mean that it would violate the law in the UK. So that should not be a barrier.
Great.
I'm going to say the argument about what fiduciary responsibility actually consists in is a vigorous one, and the incompatibility of certain investments with the professed values or goals of an investor, that's a valid reason in law. I think you could press the fiduciary thing in terms of open discussion about stranded assets and the like. So there's an argument to be had. I'd just add on your questions also, one reason for setting out the ethical cases I did and talking about justice in terms of what is owed to the real world. I think that is important, simply encountering counsels of despair. We do have just enough also to say, again, forgive the unintentional pun, that the climate does change morally over the years. We've seen it. I've seen it. Amazing over the last 5 years. And to talk of virtue signalling is, to my mind, like talking political correctness. It's one of those phrases for which certain people reach when they are embarrassed at some level. And I would willingly ban the term virtue signalling as I would ban the term political correctness. These words are always used by people who wish to delegitimize their opponents rather than argue.
Maybe Fiona, do you have something to say to this question of if people feel or use the argument of powerlessness?
I think that you have to sort of get beyond that in some way, and you have to get beyond what is the kind of immediate effect of what you're doing. I just want to give the example of The Guardian has recently decided that it will no longer accept fossil fuel advertising. No longer accept advertising from fossil fuel companies. It's the first newspaper, or the only one to do that, to make that decision. And you know, there was a lot of discussion kind of leading up to it. In a way, I suppose we could have taken that decision 5 years ago. But really, when we came to sit down and make that decision, it was the easiest decision ever, really. I mean, you know, there have been so many kind of arguments on both sides, and you know, it is damaging, it's economically damaging, and there's the question of, well, how far do you go, you know, if you're going to stop taking advertisement for fossil fuels, but well, you're still going to take advertisements for cars or for holidays or airplanes or whatever. So there were lots of kind of side issues, and they were very important that those issues were aired. But when it came down to the actual kind of punch decision, are we going to do this or are we not? It came out quite simply. No, we can't continue to take advertising from fossil fuels. We can't write about the challenge that we're facing as a world, as a species. We can't write day after day, putting this on the front page, constantly trying to bring it to people's attention and saying this is a calamity, this is a disaster, we're in the middle of it and we can stop it. We can't continue to do that and in all conscience accept advertising from these people, accept money from these people. We're not going to do it anymore. And that's what we do.
Yeah. And have you got anything else to say about this idea of powerlessness?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very easy to kind of slip into a kind of counsel of despair and feel that you don't have that power. The only real antidote to that is to find the places where you can act and to act. So there's a you know, what gives or takes away hope is not so much the, you know, the grand scheme of what's out there. It is the sphere of personal action and personal responsibility. Are there places where we can act in a way that's consistent with the kind of world that we live in, as Rowan was saying? Yes, there are. Sometimes they will even benefit us in unexpected, totally unexpected ways. The Sustainable Futures Funds are outperforming the benchmark. The USS Equities Fund is outperforming the Growth Fund. There are places where we can not only act, but we can benefit from those actions. And the places where those opportunities are exhausted and we can no longer act in those ways, then we can still get out and rebel on the campuses across the country to make the world tomorrow better.
Great, well, I'm going to wrap up there, so we have a chance, we'll have half an hour. I think hopefully all the speakers can still be around for a little bit to answer your questions. I think that was really, really inspiring from all three of you, and a clear indication, act where you can act, and lots of good indications about how morally and for many other reasons it's really important that we take action on these issues now. Thank you so much for putting together this panel, and for all of you for coming. It's so nice to have a packed room. And thank you, of course, to Fiona, Rowan, and Tim for their brilliant presentations and insights.